Hi, thank you for joining today's webinar on cannabis and food service. I'm James Rylett, Vice President for Central Canada here at Restaurants Canada, and I will serve as your moderator today. I'll introduce our guests in a minute, but first a couple notes about the webinar. After the presentation, we will leave time for your questions. If you're logged on to the webinar, you'll see a text box to type questions in. Feel free to send your questions at any time, and we will address them at the end. Also to note, this webinar will be recorded and will be made available through our member portal for future playback. Keep an eye out for that in the next couple of days. Today we're fortunate to have with us Chad Finkelstein, a partner with Dale & Lessmann LLP. Chad's specialties lie in franchisee law, licensing and distribution, intellectual property law, and brand marketing and advertising law. He has a wealth of experience in the food service sector and cares deeply about our industry. In addition to his legal experience, Chad has discussed the issue of cannabis and food service with many operators of all sizes and concepts, and has extensively studied the concerns raised. Well, we only have an hour for this complex topic, so I'll turn it over to Chad. Chad, thanks for being here today to discuss this topical issue.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining. As Jamie mentioned, my name is Chad Finkelstein. I'm a partner with the firm of Dale & Lessmann in Toronto. There is going to be quite a lot that we're going to cover today, and there's going to be quite a lot in the form of some data and some infographics, and we may get through it a little bit quickly. So if there is any information that you see that you'd like to get a copy of or get the study that I refer to, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll have my contact information at the end. Here's a bit of an overview of what we're going to try to address today. We're going to spend the first 15 minutes or so going through a general overview of what the state of the law is as it relates to cannabis in Canada. We're going to talk about what the history of legalization is of cannabis in Canada, what the current state of the law is, what the path to legalization going forward is going to be, and what we can expect from the various regulations that are going to be enacted by each province. And then once we've gone through that context and gotten a sense of what the law is as it relates to cannabis, then we're going to talk in more detail about what the effects of legalization on restaurants and food service actually are. And we'll explore some of the potential legal challenges as well as some of the opportunities that this new world may represent for everybody. And actually, just before I get started with the substance of the presentation, everybody is probably aware that legalization of cannabis was supposed to be effective as of July 1st, 2018. And then some announcements were made a few months ago that deadline would likely not be met because the provinces were not ready and the legislation would not be finalized in time. Just this morning, I saw reported in the Globe and Mail that senators in Ottawa have been pushing for further changes to the cannabis bill with respect to what is going to be permitted to be grown in households. So it's possible we see even a further delay. At this point, we're all just speculating. So before we get into the meat of it, I think it's important just to have a note about terminology. We're going to be referring to cannabis during this presentation because cannabis is actually the accurate botanical term for the plant that is referred to when we talk about the substance. Marijuana is actually a term derived from the Spanish word that was adopted in the United States in the early 20th century to reinforce the connection between devil's weed and Mexican immigrants who allegedly first introduced it to American society. And here you can see some of the headlines in newspapers from that time, dated around 1915. In 1937, at a House of Representatives hearing, a representative from the American Medical Association stated that cannabis is the correct term for describing the plant and its products. Marijuana is a mongrel word that crept into the country over the Mexican border and has no general meaning. Marijuana is not the correct term. So we're going to be using the term cannabis, and that's why you hear legislators and industry stakeholders always refer to it as cannabis, because in fact the colloquial term marijuana is something that has something of a nefarious background. So the history of legalization in Canada. The first thing to know is that cannabis was first prohibited in 1923 in Canada under the Narcotic Drugs Act. And it wasn't until about 1937 that police first began their seizures of the drug. In 2001, Health Canada created regulations around which cannabis can be used by individuals for medical purposes. This policy was implemented as a reaction to the Ontario Court of Appeals ruling in R.V. Parker that cannabis prohibition without any exemptions for medical use was overbroad. In August 2016, the Canadian government began to allow individuals to grow their own cannabis for medical purposes or designate someone to grow it for them. In the decision of Allard v. Canada, it was a case where the courts ruled that individuals had the right to grow cannabis for their own personal medical use and not be restricted to purchasing medical marijuana or cannabis solely from licensed producers. And that brings us to April 2017, when the federal government introduced Bill C-45, also known as the Cannabis Act, which will, at some point in later 2018, I guess we're looking at late summer or early fall, it will legalize recreational sale, distribution, and use of cannabis throughout the country. Here's some information on your fellow Canadians and their consumption of cannabis. 10% of Canadians that are 25 years of age and older have reported to have used cannabis in the past year, and over a third of Canadians report to have used it in their lifetime. Just fewer than 1/5 of Canadians have used marijuana or cannabis in the past year, at 18%. And this is most common among people who are younger, under 25, male, and who characterize themselves as least wealthy, which may often be a proxy for youth, which is 27%. We also find a higher proliferation of cannabis users in Atlantic Canada and British Columbia, which reported 25% of users in those provinces. And I found this interesting, that 22% of Liberals identify themselves as cannabis users, but not so much among New Democrats at 14%, and hardly at all among Conservatives. This is an infographic from a report that was issued by Deloitte last year, which stated that when you combine the current percentage of users of cannabis and those who report that they are likely to start using cannabis once it becomes legal, it looks like that we have a cannabis market in Canada of almost 39%. So that's almost 4 in 10 adults in Canada who say that they are currently consuming or are going to be likely to consume cannabis at the point that it's legalized. So obviously the market impact is enormous, and that's why there's so much interest in this topic. So what's the current legal status of cannabis in Canada? The possession, production, distribution, and sale of cannabis is completely illegal in Canada, other than for these strict medical purposes that I mentioned earlier. So how do you go about getting cannabis legally in Canada? Here is the only way that on today's date of May 2nd, 2018, that you can legally obtain cannabis in Canada. You have to get a prescription for medical cannabis from a physician or a nurse practitioner. Then you have to take that prescription and order cannabis or seeds from one of the licensed producers of cannabis who are licensed by Health Canada to grow and distribute that product. And then that licensed producer sends you your product in the mail. That's it. That is the only way that you can legally obtain cannabis in Canada as of today's date. And that has led to a lot of confusion, in part because I think the announcement of legalization of cannabis confused a lot of Canadians into thinking that it might already be legal, or the term that's most often used is that it's a gray market. It's a gray area. It isn't a gray area at all. It's actually entirely black and white. As of today's date, it is completely illegal for any retailer, whether they characterize themselves as selling medicinal cannabis or recreational. Every single one of those are illegal operations under Canadian law. So retail sales or production by any organization other than licensed producers is completely prohibited. So that's why we've seen a fair amount of enforcement activity by local law enforcement in Toronto and in Vancouver and other jurisdictions in Canada. Not all of these dispensaries have been shut down, but many of them have been. There's some speculation as to why some have and not all have been, but in any case, every single one of them has been operating illegally. And this is just a repeat of some of that stuff that I just mentioned. So how are we going to get cannabis legalized in Canada? What is the path to legalization? The Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, together with the Criminal Code of Canada, which are what make the possession, distribution, production, or sale of cannabis illegal, that needs to be amended in order to legalize the recreational use and sale of cannabis. After it's legalized federally, provinces will need to create regulatory frameworks for the licensing and sale of cannabis, similar to how alcohol is regulated today. And that's one of the other reasons why there was so much confusion that was caused when Prime Minister Trudeau stood up last year and stated that cannabis was going to be legalized as of July 1st, 2018. That was an easy announcement to make. It was also consistent with what his one of his campaign promises had been. But really the heavy lifting at that point turned over to the provinces to come up with their own provincial regulatory frameworks for how the distribution, sale, and use of cannabis was going to be regulated within their respective borders. And not all provinces were equally enthusiastic about the prospect of having cannabis legalized. Some even suggested at the time that they would not move to legalize cannabis, they would not move to regulate it, but that was not a particularly popular position at the time. So Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act, when it is enacted, is going to provide for criminal prohibitions for the unlawful sale, possession, importation, distribution, and exportation of cannabis, including to youth. This is a theme we're going to touch on a few times in this presentation, but Bill C-45 will prohibit the promotion, packaging, and labeling of cannabis that could be appealing to young people. There's going to be a requirement that certain important health information be visible to consumers. The possession of fewer than 30 grams of cannabis will be decriminalized, and Canadians will be allowed to grow up to 4 cannabis plants per residence and make cannabis-based products at home. And that's an important distinction with edibles, where cannabis-based products are made and sold elsewhere, and we'll be getting into that in a bit more detail shortly. So what are some of the provincial options for regulation now that we've seen that at a federal level it will be legalized and provinces need to decide for themselves how to conduct and manage cannabis sale and distribution? One option is the complete control of the supply chain and sale by the Crown. Crown retail and distribution throughout the entire province. Another option would be a hybrid of public and private, where you would see Crown distribution of the product to private retailers who would then sell it to end users. One thing that we are, I think, definitely not going to see in any province of Canada is full-scale private sector, where persons in any Canadian province will be permitted to be the wholesaler, distributor, and retailer of cannabis to Canadians. This is going to be a highly, highly regulated industry. And I don't think we're going to see any province that is going to allow 100% private enterprise as it relates to the cannabis supply chain. Provinces are going to be trying to adopt a model that maximizes the ability to effectively and efficiently regulate market players, track and secure cannabis products, and of course, effectively tax the sale and distribution of it. So here's what we know about what provinces either announced they're for sure going to be doing or are likely going to be doing. In BC and Alberta, we're going to see something of a hybrid model. So in BC, for example, we already know that the BC Liquor Distribution Branch will be the wholesale distributor of recreational cannabis with opportunities for both public and private retail stores. There's also been some speculation in BC that municipalities may vary on a case-by-case basis with respect to what they will permit retailers to do. In Alberta, cannabis will be sold through private retailers who are regulated by the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission, and online sales of cannabis will be operated by the provincial government. Saskatchewan and Manitoba are going to have very similar models whereby cannabis will be sold through private retailers who are regulated by the province. And each of those provinces are going to choose through a lottery of applicants who their retailers are going to be. They're going to have a finite list of permitted retailers, and those retailers will be assessed based on character, financial capacity, and ability to control supply. What's probably best known to a lot of people on this call is that in Ontario, we're going to have a 100% public distribution model, where the Ontario government is going to control all aspects of the supply chain, all aspects of the distribution and retail sale of recreational cannabis. Quebec has tabled a bill whereby all cannabis will be sold through the provincially run liquor board, but there may be some flexibility for exceptions, and we're still waiting for some details on that. Quebec plans to open its own cannabis stores and control sales online. Nova Scotia appears to be the only province which is going to allow cannabis to be sold alongside alcohol in its provincial liquor stores. In New Brunswick, we're likely to see cannabis sold only by the province, similar to the 100% public model that's in Ontario. In PEI, we're likely to see the distribution chain run by the province as well. And in Newfoundland, I believe that there has been a call for private retailers to be licensed by the province for retail sale. So what's going to be expected as part of this provincial regulation once we have all of these stores that are up and running? Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting to follow is promotion and advertising of the product. And there's been a lot that's been reported on this in the last few months, because when the federal government started to consult public stakeholders for their feelings on how to promote and advertise cannabis and cannabis products, public health stakeholders were really pushing for plain packaging that is as plain as possible, without any distinctive features, and that brand names have to be in a certain font, color, and size. Cannabis industry representatives agreed that marketing to children and youth should be restricted, and that there should, of course, be restrictions on false or misleading advertising, but wanted branding to be allowed because that would help to reduce ambiguity between illicit or illegal and legal sources of cannabis, and that helping to build brand loyalty would be a better thing for the cannabis industry when trying to distinguish between higher quality and lower quality products. Ultimately, what the task force recommendation at the federal level was, and what we're seeing in the regulations or in the bill, is that cannabis products really are not going to be allowed to be promoted in any meaningful or colorful or interesting way. In fact, these products need to be packaged in a way that is as sterile and as bland as possible. So that way we get branding like this, really exciting name and logo from the Ontario Cannabis Store. You're likely to see brands like this on packages and labeling of cannabis products in retail stores. So things that really aren't to elicit or entice any excitement whatsoever about the product. And now edibles. So edibles were prohibited initially by Bill C-45, but since that date, in recent months, the government has said that edibles will be regulated within 12 months of the legalization, whenever that date is. Currently, the government is only permitting dried and fresh cannabis and cannabis oils, and edibles can be used personally, but we're going to start to see what the regulations are going to look like for the sale of edibles in Canada. So I think some of the things that we can predict may be the case, and I should just stop here and mention that, as many of you may be aware, in the United States, cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, but certain states have gone to decriminalize it or legalize it within their borders. The earliest ones to do so were Colorado and Washington State. And so a lot of the information that we have, upon which we can speculate in Canada, is based on the experience of the cannabis industry in Colorado and Washington. And so based on those states where edibles are regulated and are permitted to be sold, some lessons that we can probably extract that we're likely to see whenever edibles are regulated are that, of course, all products should be prohibited that are going to appeal to children or resemble familiar food items to children. Edibles are likely to require opaque, resealable packaging that is childproof. Packaging will need to be implemented with standardized single servings and a universal THC symbol. There will probably need to be a maximum amount of THC per serving per product. There'll be all sorts of warning labels and appropriate labeling similar to nicotine products and dissimilar from alcohol products. There's strong support in Canada for prohibiting the co-sale of cannabis and alcohol and tobacco from the same location, despite what I mentioned earlier about what's likely to happen in Nova Scotia. I think it's likely that any retail outlet is not going to be permitted to sell both cannabis and alcohol. So we'll touch a little bit later on potential opportunities for restaurants as it relates to the sale of alcohol, as it relates to the sale of edibles. But if you are a facility that is going to be selling edibles once they are regulated, it stands to reason, and you should expect that alcohol sales won't be permitted at the same time. In order to, and the same goes for the actual for current liquor stores as well as the cannabis stores once they're in operation, so aside from restaurants. In order to control access and curb overconsumption, provinces and municipalities should be considering legislation and bylaws that prevent the proliferation of storefronts that sell cannabis or cannabis paraphernalia, and ensure that locations are an acceptable distance from schools, community centers, and public parks. And we've seen some of that in some of the regulations that have been issued by the Ontario government as it relates to the location of the various Ontario cannabis stores. It may be the case that any retail outlet that sells cannabis is going to be required to have staff that are trained and knowledgeable about the product as well as being able to enforce minimum age restrictions to help prevent youth access. So now let's talk about what this really means for restaurants. We've got an overview of the law, We know what the law is and some speculation on what it's going to be. So what does it mean for your individual restaurant and food service businesses? And again, a lot of the data that we're going to go through in this portion of the slides comes from statistics that have been extracted from the Colorado and Washington state experiences, and chief among those Denver and Seattle. So here's a bit of an overview of some of the issues that you as a restaurant owner and an operator may expect to see. In Colorado state, restaurants are reporting that alcohol sales, and I should also mention that this is all pretty new data. I mean, relatively speaking, cannabis legalization is fairly new in these states, so there is some inconsistency among what has been reported across various studies, and some of these studies are based on statistics that were collected as recently as 2017. So there's something to be said for using this as a predictive model for Canada, but some of these studies are still maybe too new to be verifiable. But in Colorado, restaurants have reported that their alcohol sales have been down 2% to 4% since cannabis was legalized. Denver restaurant owners attribute this to people opting to ingest cannabis rather than having a drink. A consulting group that took a look at how that might play out for Canada predicted that alcohol sales may be expected to decrease by 1% in Canada once cannabis is legalized. In Colorado, restaurants have been losing workers from their restaurants to cannabis retailers. In many cases, employees can earn $20 to $22 an hour with full benefits, and that has proven to be a significant draw away from the restaurant industry. And we're going to unpack all of these different categories in the coming slides. In Washington state, the gap between alcohol sales and cannabis sales has been closing. At the end of 2016, only $37 million separated the two markets. You can see the cannabis sales accounted for $212 million and alcohol sales $249 million. How does that touch food sales? Well, it's a little bit tough to say, and some of the data that we've seen in the States has been a little bit uneven. What this infographic is based on is there was a survey that compiled over 150 million consumer trips to quick service restaurants at various U.S. states with and without legalized cannabis. And what it showed was there was actually no difference in the volume of food sales between them. And this was consistent across several different QSR brands. So, to the extent that some people might have thought that cannabis was serving as a substitute for alcohol, and people were buying alcohol products, alcoholic beverages less, but maybe buying more food, that may not necessarily bear out. And specific to beer, in 2016, the U.S.'s biggest beer brands saw sales volumes decrease between 2.4 and 4.4% in states that had legalized cannabis. So now let's unpack some of these information categories in a bit more detail. The University of Connecticut and Georgia State University conducted a study on the impact of increased cannabis on the consumption of alcohol in the states from 2016 to 2014. This 2017 study suggested that alcohol and cannabis are substitutable products. The study found that in states that had legalized the medical use of cannabis, monthly alcohol sales dropped by 13%, and these effects were not short-lived. They subsisted for up to 24 months following the date of legalization. The authors of the study suggested this means that the decrease in alcohol sales will be even greater once recreational cannabis has become legalized. More recently, a joint study by researchers at 2 U.S. universities and 1 in South America claimed that a reduction in the U.S.'s overall alcohol consumption appears directly related to the rise of medical cannabis laws that were enacted in a number of U.S. states. The overall conclusion of these studies is that cannabis and alcohol are proving to be strong substitutes for each other. In other words, they share almost the same market, and that may be surprising for some. If that's true, it stands to reason that introducing legal recreational cannabis is likely to have a negative effect on restaurant alcohol sales. From the Deloitte study that I mentioned earlier, here's another infographic which shows that 25% of Canadians say that they never consume alcohol and cannabis at the same time. 20% say always or most of the time, and 55% say occasionally or rarely. So it is looking very reasonable to predict that alcohol sales at your restaurants are going to be affected once cannabis is legalized. In Colorado, a study that was released in 2016 by a New York consulting firm found that beer sales fell in states that permitted the sale of recreational cannabis. Their analysis reports that beer sales by several of the larger domestic producers had collectively underperformed the past 2 years in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington state. The analysis showed sales volumes of premium beer like Coors Light and Bud Light had dipped by 4.4%, while economy beers like Budweiser or Coors had dipped by 4%. Individual yearly spending on legal weed has started to outpace the individual yearly spending on alcohol, and this is most noticeable, according to the study, in the demographic of 18 to 25-year-olds. How might that relate to food sales? So as I mentioned, we don't really have any hard data that's all that reliable at this stage. And as it relates to cannabis, people most often look to, I think, what the effect on quick service sales might be. We don't really have a lot of reported data on what the impact of cannabis is on the food sales at full service restaurants or fine dining establishments. So I found this pretty interesting, that it doesn't really speak to whether sales are going to increase or decrease once cannabis is legalized, but I thought it was sort of interesting that among cannabis users, this Green Market Report study showed that the overwhelming favorite among cannabis users was McDonald's, followed by Taco Bell, and then Wendy's, and then Burger King, and then Subway. And of course, these statistics may be a reflection of the number of locations that each of these franchise concepts have. But nonetheless, if any representatives from any of these companies are on the webinar today, you've got a lot of fans out there. So this doesn't really, again, speak to whether food sales are necessarily going to be negatively impacted or positively impacted by cannabis legalization. But people have not stopped going to quick service restaurants in states where cannabis has been legalized. So now let's unpack that concept of employee attrition again that was raised earlier. There has been anecdotal evidence that points to an exodus of restaurant workers, primarily low-wage kitchen staff, to the greener pastures of the cannabis industry. Earlier this year, the Denver Post reported that Denver restaurants were having a near impossible time hiring and retaining cooks. While there's not a lot of hard data on the exodus of workers from the restaurant industry to the cannabis industry, what the Denver Post reported is that many Denver chefs and restaurant owners believe that along with a low unemployment rate in their city and a frenetic pace of new restaurant openings, legal cannabis is a major reason for their employment crisis. A communications director for the Colorado Restaurant Association stated that nobody is tracking how many kitchen workers leave restaurants for jobs in the pot industry. Why do people leave most jobs? It's for money or labor conditions. And in Denver, entry-level restaurant workers might make up to $14 an hour, compared with $20 to $25 an hour in most local retail outlets of cannabis. And the work is often far less demanding without the stress or the heat of a kitchen. So that's something for restaurant owners to be prepared for in Canada, is that as retail outlets start to pop up, you may experience some employee attrition with some of the perks of working in a cannabis retail outlet that's possible a restaurant cannot compete with. And here is an example of why the cannabis retail experience may be more desirable than a restaurant one. So now that we've spoken about some of the potential operational challenges and sales challenges you may be likely to encounter, and we'll get to some of the legal challenges shortly, let's get to some of the good stuff. What are some of the opportunities that exist out there for restaurant owners and food service businesses? This again comes from the Deloitte study that I referenced earlier, where they showed that the size of the cannabis market, the total market size potential of cannabis in Canada, is more than $22.6 billion. And now, from the figures that are on this infographic, the ones that I want to really focus on that are going to matter most to the people on this webinar are the ancillary market, which includes infused product makers. This is a market size that is estimated to be $12.7 billion to $26.2 billion. Now, this is where edibles come in. And also the potential upside of tourism revenue. Whether you are a restaurant that is in a position to take advantage of cannabis legalization, whether you'll be permitted to have an outlet that sells cannabis, whether you'll be able to sell edibles, whether you'll be able to distribute edibles, one thing that is likely to be true is that tourism revenue in jurisdictions that have legalized cannabis is likely to increase. And so a byproduct of cannabis legalization, even if you're not participating in it directly, is that it may well bring more people to, especially to major metropolitan areas like Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal, and restaurants are likely to see the benefit of those of the increase in people visiting those cities and spending money at restaurants. As it relates to edibles, the Deloitte study showed us this, and I can't point to it for anybody to see, but it's, I guess, the darkest green color that's in each of these charts relates to how people consume cannabis. And you can see that that darker green one relates to edibles. On a daily basis, 6% of Canadians say that they, the preferred method of consumption among 6% of Canadians on a daily basis is edibles. Weekly is 9%, monthly is 13%, and occasionally is 13%. And based on what we've seen, the market for edibles is likely to continue to grow, especially as we get closer to a date of regulation. So potentially lots of opportunities for food service businesses to be able to participate. The Liberal-dominated Health Committee changed the government's marijuana legalization bill so that edible cannabis products will be legal for sale within a year after the Cannabis Act comes into force. This was a surprise to many when it happened just a few months ago. Bill C-45 was recently amended to include edibles containing cannabis and cannabis concentrates to be sold for recreational use. And as you might imagine, this has become something of a highly politicized issue in an area that is already fairly highly politicized. Liberal MP John Oliver, the quotes that are here attributable to him, said that the 12-month window gives Health Canada enough time to work out the regulations for the different products which will become available, and that officials from Colorado and Washington had warned MPs to proceed very slowly and carefully on edibles. So he said, Liberal MP John Oliver stated, "We decided it was the right balance. Industry knows edibles will be coming to market. Canadian consumers will know edibles are coming to market, but when they come, they'll be safely and properly regulated. We have the Colorado model, which is a mature, thoughtful, and tested regulatory framework from which we can learn everything we need to know about regulating edibles. Single-serving, child-proof containers, stamped products, not marketed to children, available only where adults frequent." He went on to say, or you can leave it to Canadians to cook on their stove and buy from God knows who. So this initial reluctance or resistance to include edibles in the Cannabis Act and in the legalization regime, this is all likely to change, and along the same line, same reasoning as cannabis was legalized in the first place. If it's not regulated, people are still going to find a way to manufacture it, distribute it, and sell it. So it might as well be part of the regulated cannabis industry. A report from CBC showed that edibles are an enormous part of the cannabis market share in Colorado, where edibles are permitted. In 2014, 18% of 18% of cannabis sales were edibles, and by 2016, that number had jumped to 38%. A 2017 study by Dalhousie University found that 46% of Canadians said that they would try cannabis-infused products if it became available on the market, and 39% said they would be willing to try it in a restaurant. Only 20% said they knew enough about cooking to ever try making edibles themselves at home. Now, that's a fascinating statistic for people who are in restaurants and food service, and this may present a lot of opportunity if edibles are regulated in such a way that private businesses are able to be involved in the manufacture or the distribution or the sale of cannabis-infused food products. A spokesperson for the Ministry of the Attorney General said that we are committed to getting the transition to legalization right by making decisions that are needed now and consulting more on those decisions yet to come. This includes, and here's the important words, potential licensed establishments for consuming cannabis. So that can mean a lot of things. A potential licensed establishment for consuming cannabis could mean a restaurant, could mean an existing restaurant which will be permitted to make and serve food items which have cannabis infused in them. It may mean the opportunity for restaurants to serve prepackaged edibles on their menu, even if they don't make them in-house. Or it also introduces the possibility that a potential licensed establishment is a cannabis lounge, run completely separately and independently from a restaurant, but something that restaurant owners can see an opportunity in. Because while you may not be able to sell cannabis products directly from your restaurant establishment, you may be able to open a lounge, perhaps in close proximity to your restaurant, where people can go and consume the product safely within the confines of your establishment, where you can serve your menu or a limited menu, but likely just not any alcohol sales. So when the Ministry of the Ontario General makes a statement that the consultation for regulation related to edibles will include potential licensed establishments for consuming cannabis, this opens the door for edibles in restaurants, as well as for restaurant owners to perhaps own and operate their own cannabis lounges. So what can we predict if that were to happen? Well, restaurants, if they were going to be permitted to sell cannabis-infused food products, would likely have to make the choice between cannabis or alcohol. So a restaurant may have to make the decision of foregoing alcohol sales entirely, because it's unlikely that alcohol and cannabis will be permitted to be sold from the same location. Permitting cannabis-infused products or edibles to be served from restaurants does introduce a few complications for restaurant owners. And we're going to talk about occupier's liability shortly, because it could be very difficult to manage customer intoxication when you're serving edibles to somebody. When you serve alcohol, or when somebody smokes a joint, the effect is typically fairly immediate. And so for a server, they're usually able to see what the effect of that alcohol consumption is. With the consumption of edibles, or at least this is what my friends have told me about the consumption of edibles, is that it can sometimes take a little while for the effects to kick in. And so how can somebody possibly serve an edible or cannabis-infused food product and then feel, reliably assured that they are, appropriately serving that person? The province of Ontario is in the process of soliciting public feedback on licensed and regulated cannabis consumption in lounges and venues. And so there's lots potentially to get excited about for a restaurant owner. And again, we don't know whether that's going to be the opportunity to manufacture the edibles and sell them within the restaurant, whether you have to forego alcohol sales in order to sell cannabis from within the restaurant, or whether you can operate standalone lounges, which may even serve some of your products and be branded in association with your restaurant. As it relates to occupier's liability, probably most of the people who are on this call are aware there's a special relationship at law that exists between an establishment that serves alcohol and the customer of that restaurant. And there's a rich history of case law in Canada where restaurants or bars have been found liable for the damage that has been caused to a customer or by the customer to somebody else when that person was overserved alcohol and caused some personal injury or damage. I know this is when I speak with our restaurant clients, I know that this is of great concern to them, is how cannabis legalization is going to complicate this already, because we don't really yet know what kind of training programs are going to be in place for servers at restaurant locations. For example, somebody, and this could happen, pre-legalization or post-legalization, but let's assume for purposes of this discussion that post-legalization, cannabis consumption is going to be more likely, and that cannabis consumption is much more, it's much easier when people can bring, can vape right in the restaurant or consume an edible very quickly and discreetly in the restaurant. That server is not going to know necessarily that that consumer is now under the influence of cannabis. And when that consumer goes in, requests that one alcoholic beverage, that server may not have any way of knowing that one alcohol beverage is what tipped them over the edge. Now, of course, different people consume and react to alcohol and cannabis in different ways. But if you're a restaurant owner, you know about, the Smart Serve training program, and you know that it can't always completely help an employee of your restaurant determine whether somebody has been served the appropriate amount of alcohol. So I'm not sure yet whether any province has come up with new training programs that are going to be required for those servers of alcohol that relate to cannabis legalization. I hate to say it, but I worry for this industry that somebody is going to be the first test case of what happens when a consumer who's already consumed a lot of cannabis is served just a small, reasonable amount of alcohol, which pushes them over the edge, and then they cause somebody some physical harm or damage. Some other potential effects on restaurants that I want to touch on in our closing minutes before we get to questions, and these are things that aren't necessarily legal issues, but they are issues nonetheless that I know the business that I talk with have raised as potential concerns they have. The possibility of an increase in crime coming to your neighborhood. Is it possible that having a cannabis retail outlet nearby your restaurant result in more people engaging in, kind of vandalism or related activities? Is it more likely that those retail outlets are broken into by people trying to steal the product? Does an increase in crime or the possibility of an increase in crime mean that restaurants need to invest more in their own surveillance and security to protect their establishment and their customers? What about the influx of people who come to your neighborhood now where your restaurant is located because of the cannabis retail store that's there? Does that mean that you run out of parking for your location? And when you put all these things together, is there a possibility that this has an impact on your ability to attract customers, especially families who may be weary of engaging or of sharing premises, of patronizing premises which are so close to cannabis retail outlets? And of course, the flip side of all that is there's no concern, and that customers shouldn't be all that worried about what cannabis retail consumers are going to be doing. There's no likelihood of an increase in crime. And if it was to scare any customers away, then maybe those customers will be replaced by the customers of the cannabis retail store. Well, as it relates to safety and security, whether or not cannabis legalization has increased crime rates is really difficult to determine. Studies that concern this question have relied on a flurry of data over years across different jurisdictions. And this is, of course, one of the most politicized questions relating to cannabis legalization. So I'll just say this, that in Denver, nearly a third of the crimes that have been committed in Denver have occurred near a dispensary. There were about 7,000 reported crimes within 1,000 feet of a dispensary in 2013, which was a 1.8% increase from the previous year. In Denver, crimes that have a clear connection or relation to cannabis increased from 256 in 2012 to 270 in 2015. That barely registers as an increase in crime. In Denver, most cannabis-related crime is people breaking into stores to get the drug, and there were only 192 incidents across the entire city in all of 2015. But what they have found in Colorado is that driving under the influence, arrests related to driving under the influence have increased by 10% since legalization. In Colorado, the number of cases in which drivers tested positive for THC had increased by more than 150%. In 2016, over 60% of drivers involved in fatal accidents who tested positive for cannabis also tested positive for other drugs. But basically, what this all says, and this is underscored by a report by the Drug Policy Alliance, is that violent crime rates in states that have legalized recreational cannabis have declined. So again, while this is a highly politicized issue, the data hasn't yet supported that legalization of cannabis has resulted in an increase in crime. It has resulted in more impaired driving offenses. So that is something to keep in mind, and is of course being addressed by our government right now in Bill C-46. But there's nothing to suggest yet that there's likely to be an increase in crime near your establishment if you're near a cannabis retail outlet. What kind of effects might it have on your workplace? Well, as with alcohol, legalization of recreational cannabis will not give employees the right to freely consume the product in the workplace. Employers are going to have to give some thought to amending their existing workplace policies and procedures once the Cannabis Act comes into force, especially those policies related to substance abuse. But of course, now that has to be balanced with employers being mindful of the use of cannabis to treat an illness or medical condition. So employers are going to need to be extra vigilant about their employees' consumption of cannabis and revisit their employee policies to make sure that they are aligned with the effects and the objectives of the Cannabis Act. I also want to talk about the effects on real estate of cannabis legalization. In a study published in August 2017, researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison found that Denver home prices in the immediate vicinity of recreational cannabis outlets rose at a rapid pace since the date that cannabis was legalized. By comparing Denver home prices from 2013 with prices in 2014, which was the first year of retail cannabis sales, researchers determined that single-family homes that were within 0.1 miles of a dispensary saw an 8.4% increase in prices compared to homes further from a dispensary. What this tells us is that cannabis-related employment is actually in Denver leading to lower crime rates, and proximity to dispensaries is resulting in increased consumer traffic, and all this results in Denver in increased property value. So if you are a tenant, regardless of where you stand on cannabis legalization, the legalization of cannabis in your area may result in an increase in property value and possibly to your rent. How might cannabis legalization affect other tenants? There may be a stigma by neighbors who have close proximity to dispensaries of cannabis use. There may be an issue of consumption in common areas. If you are near a consumption establishment, or if you are a consumption establishment like a lounge, additional ventilation may be required in order to prevent odors from escaping into the common areas or neighboring premises. And I guess the final thing that I'll say is that there may be, if you are going to be negotiating a lease for a cannabis retail store or for a lounge, there's going to be lots of things related specifically to cannabis that need to be spelled out. because there are going to be some unique needs that need to be customized to the lease premises. It'll need to be spelled out in the lease who's responsible for installing these business-specific improvements, including ventilation, as well as security walls and windows. And also there's going to be all sorts of issues with your insurer as well, and that may be a whole other topic for another day. So I guess what I'll say in closing is that cannabis legalization really introduces huge opportunities to the restaurant and food service industry. I've spoken with a lot of our restaurant clients who are very scared about the prospect of legalization. Chief among their concerns are occupiers' liability, as well as their staff's capacity to be able to manage and monitor cannabis consumption. Despite what the data may show, there still remains a concern about the a possible increase in crime rate, and it remains to be seen how a likely decrease in alcohol sales will be countermeasured, possibly by an increase in food sales, and that's where this industry comes in. This is an opportunity now as other provinces across the country besides Ontario are going to be looking into how to regulate edibles. This is an opportunity for the people who are a part of this wonderful association to be able to speak to their MPs and their MPPs about how cannabis edibles need to be properly regulated. Cannabis edibles, many studies have shown, are better, or more beneficial for one's health than smoking cannabis is. And if that's the case, then this is an opportunity to really get the government regulation right and address edibles the way possibly smoking cannabis ought to have been addressed in the first place. So that way the people who are interested in this industry in participating in cannabis legalization can do so in a responsible way based on their knowledge and experience of the industry and of their customers to have opportunities to manufacture, distribute, and or sell cannabis-infused products in a safe environment. And I guess with the remaining time we have, I'll open it up to questions.
Great, thanks, Chad. I just want to remind people we are recording this for future replays, so if you feel you have to go get munchies, go ahead, we got your back. I just want to touch on the edibles and lounges. You said that restaurants would probably have to forego alcohol sales. Is this something in other areas that it's been legalized that has been brought in as well?
I don't believe that there is any establishment in the United States, in any state, that is permitted to serve both alcohol and cannabis. So to the extent that cannabis lounges are being regulated in those states, I believe they are all prohibited from serving alcohol.
And when you say cannabis lounges, is it just areas they can consume cannabis, or is this areas where menu items would be being prepared with cannabis?
So that remains to be seen. Certainly edibles are one part of it, and I think it's likely that the consumption of cannabis-infused products, when we see it, it'll be permitted in the same retail outlets that sell, the product that you can smoke. In the event that cannabis lounges are going to be permitted in any province in Canada, I think that if smoking cannabis is going to be allowed to occur within those four walls, then the consumption of edibles will be as well. And so I don't think that alcohol sales will be permitted from those establishments, but there's potentially opportunities to have a restaurant's own menu products augmented with cannabis infusion. So it's a new take on an old favorite. I know just before the webinar started, we were talking about the possibility of making popcorn out of cannabis seeds. So we may see some good kind of creative innovations like that.
I'll make more people want to go to the movies, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. This is something, it is something you touched on, but also an interesting comment from the questions board, so I'll read it. Establishments are responsible to police alcohol consumption with serious to devastating consequences for non-compliance. Can we expect the same download of responsibility to establishment owners in relation to cannabis, and what is the best way to deal with it aside from internal policies and training?
That is a hugely important question. The short answer is there is no answer quite yet. But one thing that I've actually been meaning to do, and I'd encourage those of you on the call to do, is to phone up your local provincial alcohol commissions and regulators, and to find out what kind of training they have in mind for new and existing employees about how to augment what they know about alcohol, about the serving alcohol as it relates to cannabis. Again, I'm not sure what that training is going to do. And I know this is going to sound sort of, I don't mean to sound like a joke, but I mean, I'm not sure how you can train somebody to spot someone who's already, consumed a lot of cannabis. And you can't just tell a restaurant employee, look to see if they're giggling a lot or if their eyes are red. there's more to it than that, and the potential liability for restaurants who already do need to police alcohol consumption, it is really high, and there are devastating consequences for restaurants when a mistake is made, whether the server could reasonably ought to have known that that person was already at a level that they shouldn't have been served any more alcohol. So training will need to be offered. If this liability is going to be imposed on restaurants, some sort of augmented training program is going to need to be offered by every single province. And yes, these establishment owners will need to come up with their own policies and properly train their employees. But I'm not sure there's a good answer just yet. And as I mentioned earlier, my biggest concern for this industry is that somebody will ultimately be the test case and will provide us with some sort of lesson about how courts interpret what the liability is for restaurant owners who serve alcohol when somebody comes in already under the consumption of cannabis, I think already consumed cannabis.
Okay, thank you. And just to point out, Restaurants Canada is talking to all the provinces across the country and their licensing bodies about that issue. We believe training is an issue that will come up, and as well as enforcement. So we're hoping to have more on that in the future. From the food manufacturing side, do you have any insight on how the government or the CFIA will regulate edible producers from an employee point of view? Do you suspect they'll leverage the alcohol business model? I assume that's checking backgrounds and that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's a bit premature to start predicting what those regulations may look like, because we really haven't seen anything apart from the initial opening of public consultations and discussions about the regulation of edibles. So I think it's safe to assume that, in all steps of the regulation and legalization of cannabis, in all steps of it, there's constantly been parallels drawn between tobacco and alcohol regulation. And I think it's likely to be the case for cannabis and edibles as well. So, for example, when we talk about packaging and labeling, the question was, should packaging and labeling follow the regulated, alcohol model or the tobacco model? And certainly what we've seen is that the government is going to be following the tobacco model to make, packaging as plain as possible and as nondescript as possible. I think it's safe to say that the same regulations that relate to employees of alcohol manufacturers to make sure that those people are properly trained, have passed all background checks, are responsible. I think it's likely to be the case. And one of the things that I had touched on earlier was that at retail stores, employees are likely going to have to be trained and knowledgeable in the product, and those employees will likely need to be approved by a provincial regulator, just like the owners of those businesses will. So I think that it's reasonable to predict that the government will be leveraging the alcohol business model for the regulation of employees who may be in a position to manufacture edibles.
Okay, thanks for that, Chad. Simple question: when do you expect the legislation regarding edibles and lounges to be finalized?
We don't even know when the legislation regarding cannabis is going to be finalized. So I wish I had the answer to that question. Apart from, and the announcement was made fairly recently, just a few months ago, about edibles now, likely to be right. A year ago, when we were talking about the legalization of cannabis, edibles were decidedly not on the table. In the course of less than a year, we've now seen that edibles now are going to be part of the discussion and will be regulated. So no timeline at all has been issued. The only timeline that I've seen as a reference is that the plan was to have edibles regulated within 12 months of the legalization date of cannabis, and that date keeps getting pushed back.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of questions around the maximum serving levels and what buy-in for restaurants would be. So I assume this answer would be the same. We simply don't know yet until the regulations.
Yeah, and I apologize for having so few concrete answers and so much speculation. But that's sort of the state of cannabis legalization right now. A lot of it is speculative. Much of what we know, or what we think we know, is based on using the test cases in Colorado and Washington as kind of predictive models for the rest of Canada. But a lot of this still remains unknown, and most of the provinces, with the exception of Ontario, which knows it's a 100% public distribution and sale model, so there's really not a whole lot for private enterprise to have a say in. The other provinces have they haven't finalized their regulatory frameworks in any meaningful detail yet. We, for instance, don't yet entirely know what the eligibility criteria are going to be in those provinces that are going to let private operators be retailers of cannabis. But it's safe to assume that there's going to be some assessment of the economic, viability and financial capacity of the operator, an employment history, a regulatory or disciplinary proceeding history, criminal background history, and there's going to be, similar to all of you who are on the call who know how to go about applying for a liquor license. I think it's going to be probably a little more probative than even what a liquor license is to apply for. I think that possibly statements of personal net worth may be required to be disclosed so that the government can see and sources of where people get earn their income from, so that the government can assure that it's all coming from no applicants' personal funds or business funds come from illicit sources. And I think that directors and officers and shareholders of companies that are applying for licensure, and the directors and officers and shareholders of those affiliated and parent companies of the applicant are all going to need to be submitted. And that would just be my guess.
Okay, thanks. This is an issue, and again, I don't think you'll have the answer, but I know this came up when we discussed it before, and I'd like your opinion on it, I guess. What will happen to servers and owners that were convicted to now work in the edible business as an owner?
Yeah, so yes, that still does remain unknown. Certainly the position of a number of, higher profile cannabis advocates in the country has been that people who have operated in the cannabis space in the dates leading up to legalization should not be precluded from participating in a legal cannabis market, because it's because of the actions of those people that trailblazed the way for legalization to even be, accepted at all. Others take the position that, if you had been offside the law in any date prior to legalization, if you had been selling or distributing or operating businesses that sold cannabis illegally, then it doesn't matter that, we've been talking about legalization for the last couple of years. What matters is, you were breaking the law. It was a criminal offense, and you should not be able to participate in the legal cannabis market. And so, to that end, when we're talking about servers and owners who might want to apply for licenses to operate retail outlets, or to cook with cannabis, or to sell edibles within their premises, I don't know that having a criminal background is going to automatically preclude those people from being properly licensed, but I think it's reasonable to expect that the nature of that criminal activity, of that criminal background, the nature of their history in the kind of in the world of cannabis is likely to be heavily scrutinized. But I'm not sure that we can say, in absolute terms, that if you ever had a conviction, you will not be allowed to be an employee or an owner, full stop. Okay.
We talked about this before we went on the air, and do you have any info regarding the R&D process, and are there chefs that you're aware of testing recipes for edibles?
So I'm going to engage in a little bit of shameless self-promotion here. In 3 weeks' time, I'll be sitting on a panel in Chicago at the National Restaurant Association show, discussing this topic about how cannabis is going to affect food service. And one of my co-panelists is an individual named Chris Sayeg. I think I'm pronouncing his last name right. You can check him out at theherbalchef.com. And he is one of those people who, I think he's headquartered in Las Vegas, who is kind of leading the way in terms of culinary cannabis and food science, and I guess coming up with new innovative products. As it relates to R&D that's currently underway in relation to serving of edibles, I think that licensed producers, the producers of cannabis licensed by Health Canada, are, it's probably reasonable to expect that they're already exploring how to take their product and be able to convert that into edibles. But I think right now that the R&D and testing of recipes that may be happening is happening by Canadians across the country in private.
Okay, thanks. This is just a clarification, I guess, on the early part of your presentation. Cannabis oil is going to be legalized or dried cannabis is legalized in 2017. Does this mean people can make their own edibles at home using the oil or dry leaves legally but cannot sell them?
That's right, they cannot sell them. There are restrictions on the amount of cannabis that you can possess and grow in your home at any given time. what you do with that product within the confines and safety and security and privacy of your own home, I don't think there's any restriction on that.
Okay, thank you. This is on on the measurement and the THC levels. Is there anything on? Obviously, you're not going to know what the limits are, but do you know of any similar roadside testing or tests that are available now to test intoxication levels?
So this is a really lengthy discussion, and probably really don't have nearly enough time to get into any more than a superficial level. But obviously, this is a big concern for Canadians as a whole. Is how impaired driving is going to be tested, how intoxication levels are going to be tested. There hasn't yet, to my knowledge, and I certainly am willing to stand to be corrected here, any product that has been announced as being approved and then regulated by provinces to use and by law enforcement to use in testing the THC levels that are inside someone's system, whether they're driving or not. My understanding is that some of the devices that are most reliable for testing THC amounts that someone has ingested are based on taking saliva tests, but taking a saliva sample is akin to taking a genetic sample, and that raises all kinds of constitutional issues about taking a genetic sample without a warrant. So I think we're all eagerly waiting to see what products are available to law enforcement to measure for THC.
Okay, thank you. We're about out of time, but I'll give one last question here. Are you seeing the same restrictions for cannabis as alcohol? That is, you can't consume alcohol on the street, and is it the same for cannabis?
Yeah, that's kind of a really interesting question, because and this is really completely outside of the issue of legalization of cannabis, I think. But I've always found it fascinating that when I go to the LCBO, I buy my product and I take it to my car, and then I go to wherever I'm going with it and I consume it in that place. I don't open the bottle and start drinking it on my way back to wherever I'm going. But if you've been near a lot of the cannabis retail stores, the dispensaries, you see a lot of people who buy the product and they immediately start to consume it. Just walking on the street, they light up a joint or they start to vape. Then they get in their car and they drive away. Outdoor cannabis consumption is something that is going to be regulated, and it's been talked about a lot. I don't think that any changes to the laws about drinking alcohol outdoors are likely to change as a result of cannabis legalization.
Okay, thank you. And I'll do a little shameless self-promotion as well. Our latest issue of Menu Magazine does have quite a bit of information on cannabis. So if you don't get that, I encourage you to sign up to get that, or go online to our Byte site. We will keep you up to date on all the newest information on this issue. And as I said before, if you this webinar will be available for broadcast later. If you have signed up for the webinar, you will get an email in the next couple of days telling how to access that. I want to thank Chad again for being here. He's always a great source of information, and we really appreciate him. Chad has put his contact information on the screen, and he's generously offered to take any more in-depth questions or legal issues. For any other legal issues, don't hesitate to contact him. He's a great resource. And again, thank you again for joining us today. Sorry that it went long, but it's a very fascinating topic. And thanks again, Chad.
Thank you.